When the HOA president called cops to remove Sarah's houseboat from their lake, she thought she had won. But Margaret had no idea that this quiet software engineer actually owned the entire 847-acre lake. What happened next would shock the whole community and change everything forever. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. Sarah Chin had always loved the water. Growing up poor in a small apartment, she would dream of having her own boat, her own piece of the lake, her own slice of freedom floating on calm waters. At 52, after decades of working as a software engineer and saving every penny, that dream had finally come true. Her houseboat wasn't fancy, a modest 30-foot vessel with a small bedroom, tiny kitchen, and a deck where she could sit with her morning coffee and watch the sunrise paint the water gold. She'd bought it used and spent months fixing it up herself, learning to repair engines and patch leaks through YouTube videos and pure determination. Pine Lake was perfect for her new lifestyle. The water was clean, the scenery beautiful, and it was far enough from the city to feel peaceful but close enough for her remote work. She'd found a quiet cove where she could anchor and live simply, just her and the water and the sky. What Sarah didn't expect was Margaret Hartwell. Margaret was the president of the Pine Lake Estates Homeowners Association, a woman who treated her position like a military command. She lived in a massive house overlooking the lake, complete with a perfectly manicured lawn that stretched down to a private dock. Margaret had rules for everything: what color mailboxes were allowed, how tall grass could grow, and apparently who was permitted to exist on her lake. The first confrontation came on a Tuesday morning. Sarah was sitting on her deck, laptop open, working on code for a client, when a speedboat roared up beside her houseboat. The wake from the boat rocked her gentle home violently, sending her coffee flying across her keyboard. "Excuse me." Margaret's voice cut through the morning air like a chainsaw. She stood in her speedboat wearing a bright pink polo shirt and a scowl that could freeze fire. "You can't park that thing here." Sarah looked up from her soaked laptop, trying to stay calm. "Good morning. I'm not parked, I'm anchored legally in navigable waters." "Don't get smart with me," Margaret snapped. "This is a residential area. We have property values to maintain. That floating trailer is an eyesore and a violation of our community standards." "Ma'am, I'm not in your community. I'm on the lake, which is public water." Margaret's face turned red. "I am the president of Pine Lake Estates HOA, and I'm telling you to move this junk somewhere else. We have rights as property owners, and you're disturbing our peaceful enjoyment of the area." Sarah took a deep breath. She'd dealt with difficult people before in her tech career: demanding bosses, unreasonable clients, colleagues who thought they could intimidate her. But something about Margaret's entitled attitude made her blood boil. "With respect, your HOA has no authority over the lake itself. I've checked all local regulations and I'm legally anchored here." "We'll see about that," Margaret huffed, gunning her speedboat engine and roaring away, leaving Sarah's houseboat rocking in her wake again. That afternoon, Sarah received a letter. It was delivered via a small motorboat by a teenage boy who looked embarrassed to be there. Pine Lake Estates Homeowners Association. The letter began in aggressive, bold letters. "Cease and desist notice. You are hereby ordered to remove your unauthorized dwelling from Pine Lake waters immediately. Your presence constitutes a violation of community standards, environmental regulations, and property rights. Failure to comply within 48 hours will result in legal action and involvement of local authorities." Sarah read the letter twice, shaking her head. She'd done her research before moving to the lake. She knew her rights. But she also knew that sometimes being right wasn't enough when dealing with people who had money and connections. The next morning, Margaret was back, this time with reinforcements. 3 other boats surrounded Sarah's houseboat, each carrying angry-looking residents from the lakeside houses. "Time's up," Margaret announced. "We're here to escort you off our lake." "It's not your lake," Sarah said, stepping onto her deck with her phone in hand, recording everything. "It's a public body of water." "Don't point that thing at me," snapped a man in one of the other boats. "We have rights to privacy." "You have rights to privacy in your own homes," Sarah replied calmly. "Not when you're harassing someone on public water." Margaret pulled out her own phone. "Fine. If you won't leave voluntarily, we're calling the sheriff. Let's see how tough you are when you're explaining yourself to law enforcement." Sarah's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. "Go ahead and call them. I'd welcome an official ruling on this situation." Within an hour, 2 sheriff's deputies arrived in a police boat. Sarah watched nervously as they approached. She'd had good experiences with law enforcement in the past, but she also knew that people like Margaret often had influence and connections that could complicate things. "Morning, folks," called Deputy Martinez as he pulled alongside Sarah's houseboat. "We got a call about a disturbance?" "Officer, thank goodness you're here," Margaret began immediately. "This woman has illegally parked her boat in our residential area. She's been here for days, disturbing the peace, probably dumping waste in our clean water." "Ma'am," Deputy Martinez interrupted politely, "let me hear from everyone involved." "Miss Chin. Sarah Chin." She handed him her identification and boat registration. "I'm anchored legally in navigable waters. I have all the proper permits and documentation." Deputy Martinez reviewed her papers carefully, then looked around at the lake. "Miss Chin, these documents appear to be in order. Can you show me exactly where you're anchored?" Sarah pointed to her GPS unit, showing the coordinates. "I'm anchored in 30 feet of water, well within the legal boundaries for temporary anchorage." The deputy nodded, then turned to Margaret. "Ma'am, what's your specific complaint?" "She doesn't belong here. This is a nice neighborhood. We have property values to consider. Surely there are regulations about this kind of lifestyle." Deputy Martinez looked at Margaret with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. "Ma'am, if she's legally anchored in navigable waters with proper permits, there's no violation. The lake is public water." "But what about our HOA rights?" demanded the man from the other boat. "Your HOA has authority over your properties and common areas," the deputy explained patiently. "It doesn't have jurisdiction over the lake itself." Margaret's face was getting redder by the minute. "This is ridiculous. I'm calling the county commissioner. I'm calling the state water authority. I'm calling everyone I need to call to get this floating homeless camp removed from our lake." "Ma'am, you have every right to contact those authorities," Deputy Martinez said. "But I'd suggest you make sure you understand the law before you make accusations. Miss Chin appears to be well within her rights here." After the police left, Sarah thought she'd won. She was wrong. Over the next week, Margaret escalated her campaign. She organized a petition among the lakeside residents. She contacted local news stations, painting Sarah as an environmental threat and property value destroyer. She even hired a lawyer to explore legal options. But Margaret's biggest mistake was what she did next. On Friday morning, Sarah woke to find her houseboat listing heavily to one side. Panic shot through her as she realized what had happened. Someone had opened the drain plugs in her hull. Her home was sinking. Sarah worked frantically with her bilge pump, managing to keep the boat afloat long enough to get to shallow water near the shore. But the damage was done. Her houseboat was taking on water faster than she could pump it out. As she stood in knee-deep water, trying to save her belongings, Margaret appeared on the shore with several other residents. They weren't offering help, they were taking pictures and videos. "Looks like your floating problem is solving itself," Margaret called out with a smug smile. "Maybe now you'll find somewhere more appropriate to live." That's when Sarah's phone rang. It was her lawyer, calling with news about the property research she'd requested. "Sarah, you're not going to believe what I found in the county records," her lawyer said. "About that lake situation you asked me to look into." Sarah listened, her eyes widening with each word. When the call ended, she looked at Margaret, who was still standing on the shore looking pleased with herself. "Margaret," Sarah called out, her voice carrying across the water. "I need to tell you something important." "I'm not interested in hearing your sob story," Margaret replied. "You had your chance to leave peacefully." "It's about the lake," Sarah said, wading closer to shore. "About who actually owns it." Margaret laughed. "The lake is public water, as you've been so fond of reminding everyone. Though I suppose that doesn't help you much now." Sarah reached the shore, water dripping from her clothes, and looked Margaret directly in the eyes. "Actually, the lake isn't public water. It's privately owned. Has been since 1962. Margaret's smug expression faltered slightly. "What are you talking about?" Sarah pulled out her phone and showed Margaret a document her lawyer had just emailed her. "This is the deed to Pine Lake. All 847 acres of it. It was purchased by Chin Industries, my grandfather's company, in 1962 as part of a larger land development deal that never went through." The color drained from Margaret's face. "That's impossible. When my grandfather died, he left everything to my father. When my father died last year, he left everything to me. I inherited the lake, Margaret. The whole thing. I own the water you've been boating on, the shoreline your dock sits on, and the lake bed under your boat slips." Margaret stared at the document, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. But it's always been treated as public water? Because my family never developed it? We've been paying property taxes on it for 60 years, but we never restricted access because we believed in keeping it open for everyone to enjoy. Until now. Sarah looked around at the other residents who had gathered, all of them looking shocked and confused. Now I'm wondering if I should reconsider that policy, Sarah continued. Especially given that someone vandalized my boat, which was legally anchored on my own property. You can't prove I had anything to do with that, Margaret sputtered. Sarah held up her phone again. Actually, I can. I installed security cameras after your first visit. I have everything on video. The person who opened my drain plugs. The license plate of the boat they used. Everything. The crowd was silent now, the weight of the situation sinking in. Here's what's going to happen, Sarah said, her voice calm but firm. First, whoever damaged my boat is going to pay for all repairs and replacement costs. Second, I'm going to be anchoring right here while those repairs are made. And third, we're all going to have a conversation about how to share this lake respectfully. Margaret found her voice again. You can't just, this changes everything. Our property values, our rights. Your property values are fine, Sarah said. Your rights as property owners are unchanged. But your ability to harass other people on the lake? That ends now. Over the next few days, word spread quickly through the Pine Lake Estates community. Sarah's lawyer confirmed the ownership documents with the county, and the news made local headlines. Software engineer discovers she owns entire lake after HOA tries to evict her. Margaret tried to organize resistance, claiming the ownership was invalid, demanding surveys and legal challenges. But the paperwork was solid, the taxes had been paid, and the law was clear. Sarah found herself in an interesting position. As the owner of the lake, she could restrict access, charge fees, or even drain it if she wanted to. She had complete control over something that an entire community had taken for granted. But that wasn't who Sarah was. Instead, she called a meeting of all the lakeside residents. They gathered at the community center, a mix of curiosity, anger, and nervousness filling the room. Margaret sat in the front row, her arms crossed, still defiant. I know this situation is confusing for everyone, Sarah began, standing at the front of the room. You've lived here thinking the lake was public water, and suddenly you find out it belongs to someone you've been trying to kick out. I understand that's unsettling. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. But here's the thing, I don't want to be your enemy. I didn't move to this lake to cause problems or hurt anyone. I moved here because I love the water, and I thought this was a place where people could coexist peacefully. Margaret stood up. So what do you want? Money? Are you going to start charging us rent for our docks? Sarah looked at her for a long moment. Margaret, what I want is what I wanted from the beginning, to live peacefully on the water without being harassed. What I want is for people to treat each other with basic respect and kindness. She turned to address the whole room. I'm not going to charge anyone fees or restrict access to the lake. You can keep your docks, keep your boats, keep enjoying the water just like you always have. All I ask is that everyone remembers that we're sharing this space, and we need to share it respectfully. A woman in the middle of the room raised her hand. What about the HOA rules? Margaret said your houseboat violates community standards. Sarah smiled. The HOA rules apply to the properties in Pine Lake Estates. They don't apply to the lake itself, because the lake isn't part of your community. It's my property that I'm allowing the community to use. My houseboat doesn't need to meet your architectural standards any more than your houses need to meet mine. Margaret's face was getting red again. This is ridiculous. You can't just. Margaret, Sarah interrupted gently, someone sabotaged my boat. Someone could have killed me. I have video evidence of who did it, and I'm choosing not to press charges. I'm choosing to believe that it was an act of desperation rather than malice. But that choice depends on how we move forward from here. The room was completely silent now. Sarah continued. I'm proposing we create a lake usage agreement. Something that protects everyone's rights and establishes clear guidelines for sharing the water. I'll provide the lake access for free permanently, as long as everyone agrees to treat all users with respect. Over the next month, Sarah worked with the community to draft a lake usage agreement. Most residents were reasonable people who were embarrassed by Margaret's behavior and grateful for Sarah's generous approach. They established guidelines for noise levels, wake zones, and environmental protection. They created a system for resolving disputes peacefully. Margaret fought the agreement at first, but when it became clear that the alternative might be losing lake access entirely, she reluctantly signed. Sarah's houseboat was repaired and improved, now equipped with better security and upgraded systems. She anchored it in the same cove where the whole conflict had started, but now she had friendly neighbors who waved as they passed and sometimes stopped by for coffee. 6 months later, Sarah was sitting on her deck working on her laptop when she heard a familiar engine sound. She looked up to see Margaret's speedboat approaching, but this time it was moving slowly, creating minimal wake. "Good morning, Sarah," Margaret called out, her voice lacking its former aggression. "Good morning, Margaret. Beautiful day on the water." Margaret's boat drifted closer. "I wanted to thank you," she said, the words coming out stiff and uncomfortable. "For not pressing charges. For not kicking us all off the lake. For being more generous than I was." Sarah saved her work and closed her laptop. "We all make mistakes, Margaret. The important thing is learning from them. I've been thinking about what you said. About sharing spaces respectfully. About treating people with kindness." Margaret looked out at the water. "I spent so much time worried about property values and community standards that I forgot about community itself." "It's never too late to remember," Sarah said. Margaret nodded. "I'm organizing a lake cleanup day next month. Environmental protection. Community building. I was hoping you might want to participate." Sarah smiled. "I'd be honored to." As Margaret's boat pulled away, Sarah reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd come to the lake looking for peace and solitude, and instead she'd found community, conflict, and ultimately, understanding. Her houseboat rocked gently in the afternoon breeze, and Sarah opened her laptop again. She had work to do, code to write, problems to solve. But now she was doing it on her own lake, surrounded by neighbors who had learned to see her not as an outsider or a threat, but as someone who belonged. The water stretched out before her, calm and endless, reflecting the blue sky and the promise of peaceful days ahead. She'd found her place on the water, and in doing so, she'd helped others find theirs too. Sometimes the best way to win a fight, Sarah had learned, was to turn enemies into neighbors and neighbors into friends. The lake was big enough for everyone, and now everyone knew it. As the sun set over Pine Lake, her lake, Sarah Chin smiled and got back to work, the gentle lap of water against her hull the perfect soundtrack for a life well lived on the water she'd always dreamed of calling home.